for some of our issues, some of the ills facing our race today. As promised, we have invited from the University of West Indies, Dr. Sonjah Niah, and again, Stephen Rowley, back with us, the president of the University Legal Improvement Association. Gentlemen, lady, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Steve, as we promised, let's start again. And I'm not a politician, so I'm all right, let's basically pick up very much where we left off, and that's the relevance of Black History Month and how embraced or recognized it is among our youth. Dr. Stanley, let me start with you.
Absolutely. Black History Month becomes relevant, especially in a context where we live in a country with 99.9% people of African descent. In fact, the United Nations most recently, 2012, had to recognize through the commemoration of the International Year for People of African Descent that there was so much that had not been done, either structurally in terms of making changes for economic advancement and development of blacks globally. Countries around the globe actually agreed that there was a need for this kind of recognition. So that even by observing the moves made by international organizations like the United Nations, we know that there is so much further that we have to go, and that Black History Month, in the context of Jamaica, where we are experiencing all kinds of issues related to black identity, identity crises among people, we see the phenomenon of bleaching. There are all kinds of ways in which we know that Black History Month becomes completely relevant.
Let me ask you both, do you think it's too academic, the approach right now to Black History Month? There's a lot of conversation within the university, and there's a lot of conversation from the policymakers, but does it trickle down to the black man in Jamaica?
Well, we have to remember how Black History Month started in the first place. Black History Month started in 1926 as Negro History Week, and it was started by an academia, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And this was around the era of Marcus Garvey's activities in Harlem and New York and around the world, because he was quite a global figure. And the idea was, as Marcus Garvey was trying to do, was to connect black people with their history prior to slavery. And that's still a problem today. Even when we talk about teaching Garveyisms in the schools, the issue becomes too much of teaching the biography and the story of the man rather than embracing his philosophy, which was important in connecting black people to their history prior to slavery. We still speak every month, every year now when Black History comes up, it becomes about, oh, we suffered under the transatlantic, but it's much more than that. Marcus Garvey lived at a time where they discovered the tomb of King Tut Ankamen in Egypt, and he was one of the bold voices on the platform saying, don't let the world tell you that the Egyptians were not black people. That statement in itself is still something that we don't even hear in schools today.
Steve, this one you mentioned, that whole question of Garveyism, because successive politicians have failed to basically introduce that in schools, and we still grapple with that kind of problem today. Therefore, are we supposed to blame our politicians or leaders for the lack of what you call the information that would trickle down to our...
We're always quick to blame politicians for everything, and that's part of the scapegoat mentality, I think, that we've come out of emancipation with. What do politicians do? They can only legislate. They cannot go in the classroom and teach it. The Minister of Education recently has said he's adding the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey to the school curriculum. Now, that's fine, that's a great policy to make at the legislative level, but when we trickle down to the teachers now, somebody has to address the fact that the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey really is Garvey's PR to the world. The first edition was published in 1923 on the verge of his trumped-up mail fraud case, where he knew he was heading towards prison and wanted a testimony of himself to the world, so that he was not condemned and convicted in the minds of the masses, right? It's not a book written necessarily to teach black history and to develop the things that Garvey was teaching his members and his followers. So when we talk about teaching Garveyism in the school, The point I'm making, it goes way beyond just the book that he wrote. We have to start talking about other authors like Diop, like Joel Augustus Rogers. We have to start now teaching our history as a people from the ancient civilizations and not just saying, oh, where does our history start? It started when we came off the slave ship coming from Africa.
But let me make a larger point about, going back to your intervention about the academic, the way in which we treat Black History Month is too academic. And to say that, from a personal standpoint, when I was in primary school, when I was in high school, even going through my first years at university, but particularly during high school, history was not taught in a way that I recognize myself. So that there is a disconnect in a real way for students, that when we go into the classroom, the history, we can't see ourselves in that history. And it is not taught as though it is relevant for us to take something from it, to make something of ourselves. And I think that's where it begins, and I think that's the point that Stephen is trying to make. That even as we can point to politicians as the people who would make policy, that would then translate into our school system and the way in which we seek to manage educating our population. What we do need is a holistic approach to understanding ourselves. This is, when we talk about Black history, let's not forget that we're talking about identity. We're talking about how it is we're going to see ourselves as people within the context of a 99.9% Black population. And I'm not trying to make a point about the irrelevance of those who are in the so-called 0.1%. I'm making a point about the fact that there are so many Blacks in this country who are taught history, who do not see themselves in that history, and in fact, based on what we are taught, cannot in many cases translate for themselves what Black identity should mean for them.
You speak about this absence of not being able to see yourself in the history that's taught. And you also earlier raised this issue of the complexion complex.
The color.
The color complex.
Which we still have with us.
How do we get there? How do we get to a place where the society feels it's okay to bleach? How do we get there?
Let me not start. Let's not start there though. What I find interesting is that if we think back to how it is at a very basic level in this country, we have issues with what we ourselves have created. Let's not even think about what's African. Jamaica as a society, we do not appreciate what we have created in this country. When I, for example, get up and say, Jamaica has been put on the map based on reggae and Rastafari, people say to me, no, that's not true. It's the Miss Worlds, it's sport, it is, and I have been to every continent except Australia. What I'm saying to you is that when I travel, it is unmistakable about what it is that has put Jamaica on the map. But the very things we have created, there's something in us that says we must deny that we have created these things. When you ask people, well, what is it that Jamaica has created, we don't know.
All right, Stephen, hold that point, right, because we have to take a break. You're looking at Black history, it's relevant and all that. We're going to take a break and come back with more.